Right, everyone, why don't we go ahead and get started? My name is Eric Martinson. I'm with the Public Service Commission. I'll be the designated moderator of the technical conference. This is for docket number 18-057-01. Dominion Energy, Utah's Integrated Resource Plan, time year June 1, 2018 to May 31st, 2019. As is customary, we'll go ahead around the room and have everyone make short introduction themselves, and then we'll hand control over to Dominion.
Carol Gravel to Public Service Commission.
Steve Snar with the Attorney General's Office, representing the Office of Consumer Services.
Melanie Reif with the Public Service Commission. Carolyn Roll with the Division of Public Utilities.
Kelly Mendenhall with Dominion Energy.
Dave Langwood, Dominion Energy.
Jennifer Clark, also with Dominion Energy.
Tina Pass, Dominion Energy.
Will Schwarzenbach, Dominion Energy.
Gary Dodge, UAE.
Matt Bartol, Dominion Energy.
Mike Gill, Dominion Energy.
Mike Platt, Dominion Energy.
Scott Nelson, Dominion Energy.
Bill Hunt, Dominion Energy.
I'm Austin Summers with Dominion Energy.
Doug Wheelwright with the Division.
Lance Warner, Dominion Energy.
Leila Bastag, Utah Office of Consumer Services.
Jeff Einfeld with the Division.
Myung-Hee Tuttle with the Division.
Wayne Beacom with the Division.
Joseph Holland with the Commission. Dave Clark with the Commission.
Sherry Vince with the Commission.
Great. There's a sign-in sheet that will be circulating. Feel free to fill it out, and we'll go ahead and hand it over to me.
Thank you. I think we may have you outnumbered today, a lot of Dominion Energies, but we're grateful to be here. We're grateful that all of us made it through security without a problem. Just to give you a little summary or update or reminder where we are in this process, we had our first meeting back in February, and we went over all of these exciting issues. It was a lot of fun. I think we even gave you a 30-minute time refund at the end, so it was good. Today we're going to be talking about three items: the heating season review, which Scott will walk us through, the design peak day calculation, which Dave Landward will discuss, and then supply reliability. Tina is on the injured reserve. We weren't sure if she was going to be here. It was a game time decision, but she's here. We're going to put her in the lineup, so she'll be doing supply reliability. And then we've got a couple other tech conferences scheduled. In April, we'll be doing WexPro and our RFP. Brady Rasmussen will be here from WexPro to give you an overview of the tax reform, as well as some of the compression, drilling updates, things of that nature. And then we'll talk about the RFP that we will have just completed. We've got an open conference for May if we need it, and then we'll present in June. So, without further ado, I already talked about this, and so does Scott. Good morning, everyone. My job at Dominion Energy is to run the send-out model, and so I do that quite frequently. I work for Will, so Will will be chiming in throughout my presentation to talk about things that I'm not thinking about. So this is every Monday morning, I update the send-out model, I rerun it, I put in current data that has happened during the past week, and then display that in a meeting that we have inside the company. And so most of the graphs you're going to see are those graphs that we talk about every week. There's one or two that aren't in that genre, and I'll explain those when we get to them. So heating degree days. So when we talk about heating degree days, remember it's kind of the inverse of mean temperature. So heating degree days are 65 minus whatever the mean temperature is, so you expect that to rise instead of fall. So this is the IRP line of data that went into the model back last spring. This is normal temperatures, but it's done with heating degree days. Can I just stop you right there? So we use a 30-year average on heating degree days, and there's been discussion. I know we've had a couple discussions with the division, and the next general rate case will be updating that, and we may be using a shorter time period. So we may be going from 30 years to 20 years. I just wanted to point that out.
So while we've interrupted, as he said, I'm gonna step in here. But what we've asked Scott to do this for a reason. It's not just really the heating season review. It's kind of the whole IRP year review. And this is almost like an update on the variance, right? So we're going to talk about what happened in the heating season, but how that related to what we had planned to have happen in the model in last year's IRP. So it's kind of a variance. It's what actually happened, mostly the heating season, but the whole year, compared to what we expected from the model and what went into the model. So it's kind of twofold. It's a variance and it's an update on the heating season. That's why we've asked Scott to do it. All right.
So this blue line I've put up represents actual heating degree days. In case you haven't been in Utah for the last few months, it's been a warm winter. We had, where's that thing? So we had an event here at the end of February where it was cold, and then we had a couple throughout the year. The fall was a little bit colder than what we'd expect. But in general, we've had a warm year, and just kind of wanted to point that out. We'll come back to some of these points, especially that one, as we move through. And then over here on the far end, that is what the model says we'll do going forward. So basically, we're going to continue to have heating degree days going forward, and because this is a normal curve, because the normal curve is in the normal temperatures are in the model, we're going to have normal temperatures for the rest of the year. I mean, obviously we won't, but that's what the model goes by. It has normal is more likely than my guess of hot or cold. So that's where we're going with heating degree days. Any questions on heating degree days? So then here's demand. The heating degree days are just a direct input. Heating degree demand is now data that Dave Landward's put together that runs through the send-out model and comes out as an output from the send-out model. But it looks a lot like our heating degree days, still rises in the middle, but the axis is now different. Before we were talking about degrees, and now we're talking about hundreds of thousands of decatherms in here. But again, we had lower demand than what we thought we would have because we didn't have the temperature didn't show up. We didn't have a cold winter. So we had an event here, and actually that one, the last few days of February was the biggest one we had during our heating season. And then again, on the end going forward, we expect it to follow again normal for the last couple of months of the year. And then, and the point maybe here is that this was 750, 725 in here, and our design peak day was 1.3 million. So we were a long way away from a heating degree day event, a design peak day event. And these are index prices. Last year when I ran the IRP, this was the estimate of the forward strip that we used. And then this year, our prices have been quite a bit below that. Obviously, everyone's eyes go to this point here. That was related to an Eastern market event. It was not related to a cold event here. That, I think we figured out yesterday that was a 31-degree mean temperature here in the valley. So that, I mean, it's cold. You wouldn't want to be outside without your jacket on, but it's nowhere near anything close to a peak.
I think this is important to note too, because we've noticed this a number of times, that price spikes here don't necessarily only happen when there's cold temperatures here. We've seen over the past few years, I think I've kind of talked about the same thing, but if there's really cold temperatures in the east, now that RECs can flow from west to east in particular, you know, those prices are impacted. All that gas tends to start flowing from west to east and out of the Rockies and going to markets in the east. So even though it doesn't necessarily driven by demand here in the west, prices are now impacted even more so by prices in the east as well. So that's kind of what that spike represents.
The one event that was local is this one here, and that corresponded to the cold days at the end of February. That's one price spike that is from our world.
Did you guys have to buy any gas at the peak?
Yes, we did wind up having to buy some gas that day. I mean, we've got storage. We used our storage. We used aquifers, but we did that particular day. The days that were the highest were right at the end of the President's Day weekend, unfortunately. So it was a little bit tricky for us because we bought gas on Friday for Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday because the markets were closed on Monday. So there was nobody trading on Monday. So we had to kind of do an estimate on Friday what we thought the demand would be on Monday and Tuesday, and it turned out to be a little bit colder than we thought. We've got to try and balance our storage so that we had injections on Saturday and Sunday because it was so warm, and then withdrawals on Monday and Tuesday because it was so cold. So you can only, it's not a matter of swing so much, but you try and buy evenly through the weekend and use the storage to swing. So if you have more than a 300,000 decatherm swing between Saturday and Tuesday, it causes problems. So we did wind up buying some intraday gas even for the Tuesday market day, which was some of that expensive gas there.
And then the last part of the graph is over here. That's the estimate of the forward strip from March going forward for the rest of the IRP year. And I update that every month as the new forward strip comes out. So this is the graph that has been created just for this meeting. We have a different one that we show inside in Dominion. But this talks about, this is basically the same demand curve we saw earlier. And this correlates to this left axis. And most of the things that I'll show you for the first part will all correlate to this left axis. All refers to hundreds of thousands of decatherms. Towards the end, we'll talk over here when we talk about storage. But so this is our demand. To meet our demand, we first start with cost of service gas. And this year we've been able to use our cost of service gas. We haven't had to shut in any cost of service gas, which is something we always strive to obtain. This next piece is baseload gas. Most of this baseload was acquired during last year's request for proposal. This piece out here is an extended contract, and it will also run out here till the end of April. Man, do I have the shapes or what? Anyway, it became a little bit more problematic for us to deal with this because now we have to deal with this gas plus this gas, and we have to stay in demand. Well, the goal is to stay under demand. So if we can't meet demand, what are we going to do with it? Well, we've got to find a place to put it, namely inject it. So we're going to get to that as we move through these graphs. This green piece represents peak gas that we also bought last year during the RFP, and Will was talking about this piece over here where we had demand and we were starting to run. Well, you didn't really talk about that we lose some contracts in the middle of February, and so we didn't have as much supply there as we would have had if that event had happened before the 15th of February. This red represents withdrawal from Clay Basin. And so for the most part, we don't do much withdrawing until we get in here to the winter months. And then you can't probably notice that, but I just put up withdrawal from aquifers. And then look really close. And there's a little bit from Rickman storage. And I hope you can see that because I can't see it. Yeah, I guess that was there. So then the yellow represents spot gas. So we finished meeting demand by purchasing spot gas, and that's how we meet the demand line. Continuing on, so when I started, I was trying to show this line here. So any of this gas above demand, we have to find some place to put it. And so most of that goes into Clay Basin in the form of injection. And then I skipped a little bit, but this green here also represents injection into aquifers, and in here, injection into Rickman. And we plan on using Rickman more this year than we did this past season. So now, until this point, everything has been based off this left axis. Now we're talking about inventory into Clay Basin. So when we have injections into Clay Basin, we have a positive slope in the Clay Basin inventory line. Then up here we use a little bit, and we inject a little bit, use a little bit until we get over here. And then when we have red here, we have a negative slope in the Clay Basin inventory line as we reduce inventory. And then we just picked up the line right on the bottom, which is the Rickman storage, the blue line. And then this represents aquifer gas. Again, didn't do too much with it during the summer, put some in, and then we try to maintain it full until this point of the year. And at this point of the year, we'll start to withdraw aquifer gas. It looks a lot better when you're looking at it on a laptop, but this represents cost of service gas over the last 5 years. There's a band here, that's the low amount we've received from Wexpro over the last 5 years, but there's a high amount here that I'm not seeing. Maybe you are. I don't think you are either.
I can see it over here on the laptop.
Can you now look over there at the laptop. The point being is that this year, and then this line in the middle is the average of what we've received from Wexpro over the last 5 years. So this is the IRP line, and this is this gas is given to us by Wexpro, so I put that in as a raw input. For the most part, the model takes that gas almost 100%. But the nice part is that Wexpro works with us so that we don't have to find places to put excess storage during the summer months. They have done that in years past. Like if you can see the band, it's up in here. When we get that kind of gas during the summer, it becomes really tough for us to find a place to put it. And in that event, we sometimes have to shut that gas in, and that's really not what we want to do. So Wexpro has worked with us to try to maintain that and give us gas that we can use during the summer, and then this is the actual. Then give us gas during the winter when we can actually use it. And so here they were pretty good. I think these wells came on earlier than they had planned. There's also some compression in the trail field that's added to this bump up. But this is gas that we can then use now. We don't have to worry about injecting it because we have demand for it. And then this last piece here just picks up. We're going to continue to have Wexpro gas like the IRP said because their forecast isn't changing. Now, this is a cumulative line of the IRP, so over the course, so everything we've seen to now belongs on the left axis. This one now belongs on the right axis. So over the course of the summer, or course of the IRP year, we're going to see about 70,000 decatherms from Wexpro. And then this is the variation from that. And because in here we begin to see more Wexpro gas, then you can see the red line starts to leave the IRP line. So we're a little bit above what the IRP said we would be to this point in the year. Does that make sense? Is that clear? Cost of service gas is kind of always a big topic.
I think one thing that's important to note is, you said Wexpro does what they can to adjust their drilling and their completion schedule to kind of bring more new wells on in the winter. They're not the operator in all the wells, so they do what they can in the wells that they're the operator. QEP had been the operator in a lot of the wells in Pinedale, so we didn't have, or Wexpro didn't have the control over those. They're kind of the operator. They do what they will. So Wexpro controls it where they can.
This is clay basin usage. If I was more of a PowerPoint guru, I would have this just opposite, but I'm going to show you the withdrawal first. So this is how gas was withdrawn from clay basin this year. And then this is how it was injected. So we're going to inject during the summer months when we don't have demand, and then we're going to use that gas during the winter when we have the demand and we need to use it. Intermittently, we're going to continue to inject and withdraw, but this is kind of how the model works. It fills up into October, kind of stays steady through October into December, and then begins to withdraw in the cold winter months. So again, you can't actually see this. This is my review this coming year, so if I get to do this next year, you'll see how I did on my review. But there's a band in here, a high band and a low band that again shows clay basin inventory over the last 5 years. And then there's also an average line that's gray that follows in here also. It's close, and for the most part, the green line is within that band. The green line represents the IRP number that came out of the model last year. The blue line is actually what we've seen. One thing that we've added here that we've actually removed from the other graphs is this gold line. The gold line kind of shows us what we should do on a week-by-week basis, and so instead of planning always to the green line, we plan to the yellow line because we believe that the data is more up to date. The data's been updated every week, and so that data is closer to reality. And one of the places that happened is in here. In December, the prices were low, and so the model wanted to hang on to gas in Clay Basin, waiting for the prices to go up, but that also gave us the chance to use spot gas that was less expensive. And so we try to use that, follow the yellow line, and this year prices have worked out really nice. The Clay Basin is withdrawing like we hoped it would, and will continue to withdraw along that line.
So when you see the variance reports come out, you're going to see us, going away from, instead of just following what the model told us to do back when we ran it in February, I have Scott run the model every week and give an update. The main driver there is prices. There could be a Wexpro forecast update, something like that, but the main driver being prices. And rather than just following what it told us to do back in February, we follow what it keeps telling us to do. We give it new knowledge and rerun that model. So that's why you see us operationally follow the yellow line, because that's the model that's got the most updated information with the updated prices. So we continually model all year long and say, okay, what should we be doing, and then compare it back to what it told us to do back when we filed the IRP. Does that make sense to everybody?
And then this is aquifer daily usage, and again, it's just probably exactly backwards from how I'd like it. But that first line is withdrawal from Chalk Creek, the blue, and then withdrawal from Colville, and withdrawal from Leroy, and then injection into Chalk Creek, injection into Cole, and injection into Leroy. And the way this works is during the summer, the aquifers pretty much just stay at their spring levels, which for Colville and Leroy, that's half of their total capacity, and Chalk Creek is empty. And then right in here, just before we get to the clay basin test, we put some gas in so that if we have weather during the clay basin test, like we did this year, we'll have gas to be able to withdraw from the aquifers. And then also, if it's warm during the clay basin test, we still have space that we can inject into the aquifers, so we have a place to put that gas without having to shut it in. Once we get out of the clay basin test and get into November, then we get more serious about injecting and filling the aquifers to their winter level. And then in the winter, when we may or may not need clay basin, the gas just stays there. Then when we have demand, we pull it out and then fill it back up again. And so that's kind of, it goes back and forth like that. Times we have demand, we pull it out, and then when we have time between that we think we're going to have weather, or not have weather, be more normal, then we have time to inject back in. And so that's where we are right now. And as we go through the rest of March and into April, we'll begin to pull some of that gas out. Actually, the forecast is for colder weather this weekend, so some of that gas is staying put until we get through at least this weekend because of what we see coming.
So we really try and use those aquifers as our last piece of supply, and we kind of hold them in reserve when we can in case something happens to our purchases or something happens to clay. We really, that's our reliability factor right there. We keep the aquifers kind of, our gas control likes to say, keep them in their back pocket until they absolutely need them. They are built into our peak day, so on a peak day they would be running full out basically in order to get the supply that we needed, because that's part of our peak day plan. But on those days leading up to a peak day, on those cold days, we tend to not try and use them until we need to. So you'll see a lot of cold days in there where we don't have the aquifers. Well, that's because we held them in our back pocket. But then you can see there's a lot of days when we do use them too. So.
And then aquifer inventory. So this was generated during IRP time. And that's how the model planned on using the aquifers. This is how we've used them to this point. And this last trailing piece is how we plan on using them for the last couple of months of the year until they get down to their summer inventories where they stay constant through the summer again. So we wanted to point out that the heating season has been warmer than normal. We had no design day peak events. We did have several cold snaps, and we talked about some of the issues we had in February where we were starting to lose some of our gas because the contracts had expired. Normally it's cold when it's supposed to be cold and it's warm when it's supposed to be warm, but this year wasn't one of those years.
We also, on that day we were talking about, that Tuesday in February, we also had some supply that just, we had some compressor issues at Vermilion plant, so we lost some supply at Vermilion plant, and there was somewhere else that we lost some supply as well that day.
Black's Fork.
Black's Fork, was it? Yeah, so we lost some supply coming from Black's Fork as well due to operational issues. So, but we had the aquifers and we bought some spot gas. We're able to back that up. But that's kind of just some interesting notes that even on a day that wasn't that cold, it was, I think, I want to say our 38th highest send out day. We still have some issues. So.
Wanted to point out that we had received more cost of service gas than estimated in the IRP, and we showed how that line varied going forward. And then low index prices in December. We talked about that a little bit, how following the gold line, the model suggested that we hold on to that gas until we had better prices in January, and we could use spot gas in the interim. Any questions? Okay.
Do you like this methodology for comparing to the IRP
Yeah.
kind of variance type deal? Is that a good way to do it going forward? Okay.
I'll change it up a little bit and come over here on the, I guess it would be your right side.
So we don't hurt our necks.
That's right. Let you stretch the muscles in the other direction. I think a lot of this will be review for many of you. For some of you, this might be new. What I'd like to do is talk in general terms at sort of a high conceptual level about how we estimate total demand, firm demand on a design peak day. That's demand for the entire day. I want to drill down on a couple of points that I don't think we've covered in depth in the past. I'm going to stay fairly non-technical. If you have some questions on some technical details, I'm happy to try and answer them in this setting, or maybe if it works out better, we can talk
It doesn't look like you have that app.
offline.
Apologize. Make it quiet and it talks to me.
Yeah, Siri has a question already.
Siri has a question.
But stop me at any point if there's something that's unclear or you want me to cover something in detail, a little more depth than I am. When we estimate demand for the entire day under design peak conditions, we're splitting up the demand into two buckets. We're separating demand from sales customers from that of transportation customers. And we're looking at firm service demand, so firm sales and then firm transportation. For firm sales, oops, that wasn't the button. For firm sales, we're using statistical methods to estimate daily demand based on variables that we know drive it. And for firm transportation, that's a purely deterministic approach. For the majority of transportation customers, there's a daily firm decatherm level that's stipulated in the service agreement that we're obligated to provide, of course, on a firm basis. So the firm transportation demand level is simply the sum of all of those individual contract amounts. We're obligated to provide firm service at that level to those customers, so we plan on that total level of firm transportation service on a design day. Let me talk a little bit about estimating firm sales demand. That's where we bring statistical tools to bear. We're looking at a historical data set of daily firm sales demand in conjunction with variables that can affect it, up or down. The primary one, as you would imagine, is heating degree days. I'm a horrible name with the laser, but I'll give it a try. This is a scatter plot of heating degree days versus daily firm sales in decatherms. As you would expect, intuition would lead you to understand that as the heating degree days gets higher, it's getting colder, more furnaces are burning for longer, and demand is rising. I want to point something out, and I don't know if we've talked about this a lot in detail before, but let's take the 40 heating degree days level. If you turn your eye up here, you can see that at this level of heating degree days, there's a range of demand possibilities, a pretty wide range. Now, when we're trying to plan for peak day sales demand, where we want to be is up in the top of this range, because if we plan at a particular heating degree day level for demand down here, and then it actually comes up in the higher range, we're going to fall short. We're not going to have enough gas, and that's not a situation we can afford to be in. So we want to plan for the range. I want to emphasize that heating degree days is the event, and a rare occurrence of a high level of heating degree days is what we're planning for. It doesn't happen often, but the data show that it can happen. We need to be prepared for it because we need to be providing service under all conditions. So the event that we isolate is level of heating degree days. And then we want to be able to understand the range of possibilities of demand at that extreme level. And then we want to be narrowing our focus up here. And in order to explain this range and then help us plan and estimate, we need to bring some other variables into the mix that help to explain a lot of this range. One of those is what was used the prior day. The demand level, the prior day, is a strong predictor of the demand level for the subsequent day. Wind, we know, affects demand quite a bit, particularly as it gets colder. That effect that wind has intensifies as the temperature drops. So we're looking at wind, the average speed for the gas day, along with the maximum sustained gust. Other variables that can affect demand that you might not think of intuitively, the day of the week. The data show that on average, demand is lower on Fridays and weekends than it is typically on a Monday through a Thursday of a normal work week. Demand on average is lower in the winter holidays. So these are things that we want to understand and bring into our modeling because they're going to help us narrow this range. And then we're going to make assumptions about these other ancillary variables. They're going to help us get up into this level where we want to be planning for. Now, I spoke about heating degree days being the event. You've probably heard the phrase 1 in 20 year event thrown around quite a bit. I think that there's a lot of confusion about that, what that is outside of the company, within the company. For a long time, I didn't know what that meant. So I want to explain what that is and what it isn't. And hopefully that will clarify what we're talking about. A 1 in 20 year event is what we call, it's what's called a recurrence interval. It's a way of expressing a likelihood, a probability of a particular event occurring. In the case of a 1 in 20 year recurrence level, that translates to a 5% probability of occurrence in any given year. Within a single year, there's a 5% chance that this event will occur. That 5% comes from dividing 20 into 1. That's why we call it a 1 in 20 year event. That doesn't mean that it's going to occur once every 20 years on a regular basis. It may occur once in a 20-year period. In fact, the probability of that can be calculated. There's about a 38% probability that a 1 in 20 year event occurs within a 20-year period. I know that seems counterintuitive, but I'm hoping this will help clarify what we're talking about. Again, 1 in 20 is a way of expressing a probability. So there's a likelihood that that one event will occur once, and only once, in a 20-year period. It may occur more than once in a 20-year period. In fact, there's a 64% chance that over a 20-year span that it occurs at least once. There's also a likelihood that it may not occur at all within a 20-year period. There's actually a 36% chance that it doesn't occur at all within a 20-year period. So the 1 in 20 is really talking about the likelihood of a single occurrence within a given year. And then we can look at it in a broader range and see how it might occur, what the chances are of it occurring over time. I think it might help you to solidify this a little more if we visualize it. Let me show you a timeline that plots 89 years of, that considers 89 years of annual data. What I'm talking about is for each one of those 89 years, I look at the daily mean temperatures and I select the lowest daily mean temperature for the year for each one of those 89 years. So I've got 89 data points. I'm curious, let's look at this 20-year span here from 1929 to 1949. Does anybody have any guesses about how many times during that 20-year span the mean temperature for the day, for the year, was at or below -5 degrees. I mean, does what we've talked about lead you to any kind of intuitive guess about how many times you might have seen that in a 20-year period? Remember, there's a 5% chance that it occurs in any given year. There's a 36% chance it doesn't happen at all in a 20-year period. Any guesses? Would anybody guess at least once?
Twice.
Twice? We're going to go with twice.
I'm going with twice.
Do I hear three? Twice, going once, going twice. Okay, Will's he's
Five,
throwing it all on the
okay.
table.
You can't vote if you know the real answer.
Yeah, the presentation.
Yeah, Will likes to play the odds. He's a high roller. This would actually happen from 29 to 49.
What a good guess.
Yeah. It's inside information. I don't know laws against that.
Can I just, wait, the back one slide, is this pretty much what other gas utilities do they use the same type of?
That's actually a great question. I'm glad you brought that up. That was a point I wanted to make that I forgot. Some utilities, a lot of utilities use a recurrence interval. The denominator that they choose varies. There are some that use a 1 in 20, including us. Some use a 1 in 30-year occurrence. Some use a 1 in 35-year occurrence. Some utilities, including two other gas utilities under the Dominion Energy Corporation, use the lowest temperature on record. There are several other utilities I've seen in a survey from the American Gas Association that use the coldest temperature on record. So it varies. From the information I've seen, all utilities are zeroing in on the extreme events. They're looking at the temperature spectrum and they're narrowing in on the rare but really cold periods. Because all utilities need to be prepared. It would be imprudent for a utility to ignore those and sort of play the typical average route, because we just can't afford to be caught short-handed. So yeah, that's an excellent question. Recurrence interval is common, sometimes called as temperature. Some use there are some that use a moving period, like the coldest in the last 30 years or the last 20 years. There's a mix. From what I've looked at, most utilities are looking at all the data, and they're either using a recurrence interval to kind of isolate in with probability on occurrence, or they're just taking the coldest on record from the surveys that I've looked at and the information I've gotten back.
On this slide, clarification question about the third bullet. Isn't that intended to be may occur at least once or in a 20-year period, or once or more in a 20-year period?
Once or more. Yeah, that's a good way to phrase it.
Right.
Yeah, that's probably a better way to phrase
Just
it.
logically looking at those
One or more.
ordinary categories.
So then the opposite of that would be occurring not at all.
Right, and that's
which
your
would be
36.
100 minus
Which is the
64.
36,
Right,
yeah.
which is what the 36.
Okay, great.
No, that's a good point, thanks.
So Dave, back to Carol's question. So when you compare our methodology with others, where would you consider ours to be a little more conservative? I mean, we could go, we could be using a much lower temperature, right? If we used a once in a lifetime or once in 30-year interval, it would be, our design day would be lower than 5 degrees below, right?
Right, just look at these temperatures here. If we were to go with the coldest on record, as some utilities do, we'd have a design date temperature of -11. Currently, our company uses a design date temperature of -5 degrees. That's in the Salt Lake area. -5 degrees in the Salt Lake region. It's been colder than that. It's been -11, that's the coldest on record. -8, -7. So it is, I don't want to arbitrarily pick a cutoff point, but within the extreme temperatures that we see in the data, a -5 is probably more mid-range. It's not as cold as we've seen in the past.
Is that -5 the cold for the day, or is that an average over a period?
That's the average for the day, for the 24-hour gas day period. That's the average temperature, the mean temperature of -5 degrees. It's a really cold day.
Yeah, that's a
Cold
really
day.
cold day.
A really uncomfy day. Not a day that you want your furnace to be going out. So things were pretty active a lot of cold fronts coming in that 20-year period. You know, I saw a documentary on Netflix that theorized that the planets in our solar system were actually possibly in a different order in relation to the sun, and I'm wondering, that's far enough away, far enough back. Jupiter actually might have been closer to the sun than the Earth, and maybe that explains why it was so cold in those 20 years.
Before you go on, this low temperature occurrence is the low temperature at a point in time. That's not the same as the average for the day.
Oh, that's the average.
Or is this, are we talking the same
That-
thing?
that-
Average on Salt
These are the average for the day, or is this
That's the average for the day.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, you'll notice that, again, I'm talking about, when I talk about a 1 in 20 year occurrence, I'm talking about looking at the mean temperatures for all days of the year and selecting the lowest. But it turns out that, I mean, you've got -5 and -6, but those happen back to back, 2 days in a row.
That was a miserable winter,
Yeah.
32, 33.
You had.
For a lot of reasons.
February 9th and February 10th. I'm glad I wasn't around there. Can you imagine the smoke over the valley from all the coal being there?
Okay, Will, are you gonna
Yeah.
guess?
No, I will.
Can't guess on this one.
Keeping you all in suspense. What happens over the next 2
I waited till everybody else guessed before I threw mine.
Yeah, does this give you any hint of what you might see over the next 20 years?
I'm gonna say less. I'll say 4.
Okay, let's go on with 4.
Say 0.
Okay, I've got a 0. Let's take a look. We had 2 within that 20-year period of extremely low mean temperatures for the day. -7, -7, 1 in 49 and then 1 in 1963. Any bets? Are you thinking that you might see a trend here? Any bets on what comes out in the future? If you're sitting here, maybe past the 1989 mark, you're in the 1990s, and you're looking at data going back, thinking, boy, I don't know, something that cold seems pretty unlikely now. It's been over almost 30 years, well over 20 years. Would you have any guess? Well, you might think that it's pretty unlikely to see something that low, and then bam, that sneaks up on you. It's been over 20 years since you saw anything remotely that cold, and then out of the blue, you get a mean temperature for the day of -4 degrees. Pretty darn close to our recurrence interval temperature of -5 degrees. So it can sneak up on you. I guess the point of this illustration is it's not a once every 20 years. What we're doing is counting up the number of instances where the lowest average daily temperature for the lowest observed daily temperature mean for the year is at -5 degrees or below. Looking at 89 years of data, counting up the number of times that happened for the year. It turns out that on an annual basis, I observe a mean temperature at -5 or below 5 times out of 89 years. So how do I back that in to a recurrence interval? It's just some simple arithmetic. The formula is this. I take the number of data points that I have, number of years, which is 89. I add 1 to it, so that gives me 90. And then I divide the number of occurrences that I've seen, which is 5, into that 90. So 5 divided into 90 gives me 18. That's a 1 in 18 year recurrence interval. So if I know what my event is, I can back into a recurrence interval using that simple math. Now you're probably confused at this point, thinking, well, where does the 1 in 20 come from? Did you just round up the 18 to the 20? Well, there's another way to get at that, and I won't go into the technical details, but we can work backwards. If we have a probability in mind, like say a 5% likelihood of occurrence, that translates mathematically to 1 over 20. And so what I'm looking for is a 1 in 20 year recurrence. And so what I want to know is what's the expected mean temperature out of 1 in 20 year occurrence, or the expected mean temperature with a likelihood of 5% within any given year. I can fit all my data points to a probability distribution and then work backwards. I can use that probability distribution to say, okay, at 5% probability, what is the expected low mean temperature? It turns out that that's a -5 degrees. So that's where we get the -5 degrees design day mean temperature from. But I hope I haven't ironically confused you instead of the opposite. What I'm hoping to do is illustrate how this 1 in 20-year recurrence works and what it means visually.
Can you go back to the past, the last screen? And do you have the information to illustrate on the screen from 1990 forward?
From 1990 forward, we haven't had anything even closer below to -5 degrees. We've gotten low, I mean, we've had mean temperatures, I think, as low as 0, but we've not gotten to -5. Yes, Carol?
You know, when you do your analysis, I mean, everything isn't the same across that time period. Because you think about the development in the valley and the number of people, and the number of cars, and the number of houses, and the number of, how does that all play into this? I mean, because, you know, we've all got furnaces,
Yeah, that's a great question. Even customer, if you're talking about demand, even customer growth, it's going to change the level of demand over time at a given temperature.
Well,
Is that what
I'm
you're
just
asking?
saying that there's so much more development than there wasn't, how many houses were there in Salt Lake Valley in 1929?
Oh, yeah, I don't have any
I mean,
idea.
and then you go, how does that affect the temperature?
Oh, how does that affect the temperature over
Well,
time?
because it's, you
I
know,
don't know.
yeah.
I don't know how that would affect the temperature.
How many warm bodies are breathing that day? That goes up.
How much hot air is coming out of?
Yeah, so that, stuff like that, you're just assuming everything is the same in this.
Right, yeah, I'm not making any, obviously I'm not a climatologist, so I'm not making any assumptions about what may or may not affect temperatures over time and frequency of occurrence. If anything, I'm analyzing all data points together.
Yeah,
So I'm not assuming a trend or anything like that. If anything, tells me that it's unpredictable. You can go for a long stretch and then something extremely cold will jump on you. In fact, Tina's going to talk about some instances where regions were caught by surprise with some temperatures that weren't on their radar. Yeah, I'm sorry.
That's right. Eric, I was wondering if throughout your history of modeling this, whether or not you've incorporated or at least analyzed the impacts in the valley of inversion, if it is that temperatures are locked in during an inversion, how that might impact sales, and whether or not it's been significant enough to worry about in your planning.
Well, that's a good question. In some of the model specifications that I've looked at, they incorporate things like cloud cover, maybe even wind direction. The model that I have, and I'm kind of the new kid on the block because this model in its current form came to me last June. So I've been working with it for less than a year. So like I do with any model that comes my way, I'm evaluating it and always looking at how others model and see if there might be something else I can do to refine it. That's something that I might be interested in looking at. I think what you're asking about is sort of, it's implied in the temperatures, but it may be that if we can get some good data on cloud cover going back, say to 2004, which is as far back as I go in analyzing demand, I may be able to separate those two, and that might help me get even a little better fit and increase my accuracy. Yeah, so cloud cover was one variable that I saw that some utilities use that I'm interested in looking at. Now, I don't know if that...
Particularly for Utah in the winter, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you've got the inversion, or the potential for inversions in the wintertime, and it has the ability to impact temperatures and therefore demand
Right. It could
to
be
some extent.
It could
the
be colder in the
middle
valley
of the
than it is up in Park City sometimes.
Right.
Right. Well, that's a good point. There's always something else that could be a possibility that I'm interested in looking at for that reason.
Just an interesting note with inversions, it actually makes our job of forecasting on the day a little bit easier. because when you have an inversion in place, it's almost like one day is exactly the same as the next. You're not worried about the sun coming out and changing the temperature. Doesn't really impact what the design day is, but it's an interesting note that I think it was January 2014 where we saw 6 or 7 days of cold in a row, and it was actually easy from our standpoint because every day was exactly the same,
Right.
and the cold was really focused here in the valley.
Assuming you have gas supply, right? Assuming you have
Right,
supply.
but that's what I meant by it was focused here in the valley because we had the inversion. Like you said, Park City was warmer. We had cold because of inversion. But if it's not cold, in our supply basins, then you might not have as many supply issues. So that particular 2-week period we kept referring to it as Groundhog Day because every day was exactly the same. So it can be. It's really tricky trying to forecast the weather on a daily basis, but an inversion makes it a little interesting.
Yes.
For purposes of forecasting, what source are you relying on?
For the data?
For the weather?
For temperature or?
Yeah, I'm curious from a couple of perspectives, and one is that it seems like our local forecasters are incredibly unreliable. So
That's a nice way to put it.
And your business is to be reliable, so, I mean, who are you relying on for your forecast information?
We get our weather data, and it's historical data as measured at the temperature probes after the fact. We get that from a provider called AccuWeather, used to be known as Weather Bank. They've provided our data for years and years. They have data sources from a number of different weather stations. The temperatures that I'm talking about are in the Salt Lake area, and those are coming from the weather service station out by the Salt Lake Airport. We're getting them through AccuWeather. They're collecting them for us, but that's the source that they're using. So I believe it's NOAA.
So
that's historical data, but
that's
Will and Tina, what do
historical
you do
from
for
from our point of view, where we're looking at the day-to-day forecast. We look at a number of things. We look at the AccuWeather forecast, so those weather stations kind of have their automatic forecast that comes in. We also look at all of the the people doing the forecast in the morning look at all of the local stations, right? So they're looking at KSL. Whatever there's 4 or 5 different local stations that are all doing the weather forecast. We look at all those different forecasts and try and see if any of them are in line with each other. If there's any outliers, we tend to throw them out. And we're looking at what the best available information is. So we look at all of those, and if there's any that usually a few line up and one of them's kind of out there, and we'll throw that out. But we kind of look for what the not the average, but kind of which ones look the most in line and go with that. Then we use a software package called Gas Day, which is an industry standard kind of thing. It's actually done as a program out of Marquette University, and that does a statistical analysis of our demand on a daily basis and compares it to that to those forecasts that we put in. So we do look at a number of sources. We don't just say,
Is
well,
this for your
it's
daily
looking-
operations, or is this for planning to meet peak as well?
This is for daily. So that's a day-to-day type thing. And that's where the day-to-day forecast really comes from. So we look at all the sources that we have available. We are only as good at forecasting on the day as our weather stations, our weather forecast sites are. And I will say that like the AccuWeather does a pretty good job of forecasting on the upcoming days. Where they do tend to fall short is when you have an inversion. Those like your Weather Channel forecasts and stuff like that, you might as well throw them out whenever there's an inversion involved. They don't understand it. They don't know what it means. Our local stations do a little bit better when there's inversion related to it. But so we look at a number of sources is the short answer.
But how many days are you trying to forecast out, though? You're not trying to forecast out 10 days or 2 weeks necessarily, are you? You're a lot closer in your forecast.
We do. We forecast. So we send out a morning report every morning to kind of internal sort people to let them know what's coming. But we have to look forward to what's coming. But we don't, unless it's a long weekend, we're only buying for the day ahead. So the only one that really matters is the next day. except over a weekend where you have 3 days or a long weekend where you have 4, and that's where it starts getting trickier. We do look ahead to try and see what the trend is going to be, but we're really only purchasing normally either 1 or 3 days ahead of time.
Is there any other questions that I can answer? Okay, well, I'm actually boring myself, so now I'm going to turn it over to Tina.
I was going to start with a safety moment, but after listening to Dave's presentation, I'm going to hold him accountable because I think that he said I had a 1 in 80-year chance of riding a toboggan in a ski resort, and actually it was closer to 1 in 40 about the years I've been skiing. So has anyone ridden a toboggan in a ski resort? No. I thought about Carolyn's husband. Oh, Will has. Very, very nice people. Very responsive once they know you have a problem. The problem is communicating with them when your ski buddy has left you. So that is probably the safety moment. Be prepared. Make sure your cell phone works. Don't ski somewhere where your cell phone doesn't work. And put your skis up as soon as possible to try to attract someone's attention to get the ski patrol. But the toboggan ride is not enjoyable. And I'm going to go after Dave for his forecasting of that. That's not okay with
I'm
me.
used to it. I'm used to it.
The good news probably is that there's going to be a lot of snow from here on out. Just in case you're skiers or snowmobilers, you'll be enjoying it. So I'm going to discuss some supply reliability concerns today. First of all, just start off, this is probably a review for all of you, but the idea that the gas that our customers burn comes from many, many hundreds of miles away from their burner tip, actually. Exploration and production takes place, in our customer's case, for the most part in Wyoming, Colorado, a little bit in Utah. Then it moves through gathering lines, processing plants, then transmission lines, sometimes for also long stretches of many, many miles, and then to our customers in the distribution line. So just a little review that I think a lot of times people think it's close by, easily accessible. That's really not the case for our supply. So I thought it would maybe show, nope. Doesn't really show the production basins, but the overthrust area, if you can read that in the Green River, it's supposed to be a little bit darker, but that's kind of where the gas supplies are. And then the purple or pink and yellow line, or the pink lines are the transmission lines, upstream pipelines, and then our distribution is in yellow. So you can kind of see proximity-wise where the gas has to travel to get to our customers. So today's not a cold day, but we're going to be talking about cold days. And we rely on our suppliers to provide us gas every day. We have contracts. We expect the gas will show up when we purchase it under contract. But it turns out it can be disrupted for all different kinds of reasons throughout the chain. Every part that we just talked about. The wellhead could have issues, gathering lines, the processing plants, the pipelines, and actually our storage can also have issues. Turns out when it gets cold, these disruptions happen more often, and we've seen that the last few years. And it's been a concern to us. Temperatures are a lot colder at the wellhead. Information I've gotten from Dave over the last couple of months, it could be on those cold days here when you saw -4, it's going to be 20 or 30 degrees colder than that in Wyoming, and then with the wind chill it's even colder than that. So things don't last or don't seem to work well long term under those kinds of temperatures. So you see things freezing off, processing plants have mechanical issues, interstate pipelines start moving a lot more gas, allocate capacity, and the storage fields also allocate capacity in the past history of cold weather. And this is something that I think maybe just needs to be said, maybe you already know this, but upstream pipelines will only deliver the gas that's received into their pipe. And when some of these upstream sources end up not putting their gas into the pipe is only going to deliver what it gets. So it's going to short the downstream customer if they don't have supply to give. So doing a little bit of research, I don't know if you guys remember, it made the news back in February of 2011. There were some customers that lost service in Arizona, specifically in Tucson area, about 24,000 customers. It took them about 7 days to restore service. And there were a lot of hearings, and reading the transcripts from those hearings and open meetings, a lot of public meetings, the Vice President of Gas Supply at the time said this was a 1 in 60 year weather event. So it kind of goes back to what Dave was talking about, much more than they were planning for. And he specifically said in the transcript that this 1 in 30 year peak weather event that they've been watching and planning for his whole career, which was 30 years, had been getting warmer every year. So they were kind of having a rolling average, and so it caught them by surprise that it was not only a 1 in 30 year number, but a 1 in 60 year. And then he also commented that they saw the cold weather coming, but the lows continued to get closer as it got closer to the event. And that's kind of, I think, Melanie's point, that these weather forecasters really don't, it's hard to know until you're right upon it. So here is just an illustration of what they saw, and this kind of goes along with maybe some degree day data that both Scott and Dave mentioned, but they were looking at planning for a 29, and of course from our standards this doesn't seem very cold, but to them it is very, very cold, and it was very windy, so they were not prepared for this kind of weather there. And actually it was a 23-degree mean, so. And it again came in, from their perspective, out of the blue. There was also the same weather front. New Mexico had lost 19,000 customers. Took them 6 days to restore it, and they ended up setting up $1 million fund to help with customer claims.
But wasn't the problem on those though in the gas basins where it was so cold and the wells froze off?
Mm-hmm.
And so, and they did a lot of work afterwards. Didn't the suppliers go and put on freeze protection devices and stuff like that after?
I'm not sure about that. I know it was not just wellhead, it was processing plants, and they had some other issues along the line. But yeah, they lost, it was a cold weather event throughout the US, I feel like, but they were getting a lot of their supply from Texas. They didn't have storage, they didn't have, some issues like that. And I'm not sure how they addressed the wellhead. Does anyone know if there were specific wellhead concerns that they?
I thought it was all the wellheads froze off. That was the big problem.
It was a big part of it, yeah.
They also had some issues, I believe, with either the processing plants or the compression along the way that was power driven, and they had power outages due to the cold weather. So the power outages had a negative impact on the pipelines and the processing plant's ability to deliver the gas. So they had kind of a perfect storm of events kind of thing where, one thing led to another, a domino effect of, the power went out, and power meant the gas wasn't going to get there, so.
So all these, I guess, over the years, or since 11, have gotten my attention, mostly because knowing that if a similar situation were to happen here, it would be a lot worse just because of the colder climate that we live in. Another one in West Virginia, this was actually one of our new affiliates, December of 17, due to a compressor station failure. They lost service. It was a small town of Weston, 2,500 customers, took 6 days. So if you think about people being without gas for 6 days or 7, in Utah and in a cold weather event, it's going to be not a good situation. So just want to talk about issues on our side. Specifically, we've had 5 instances in the last 5 years where we've had supply shortfalls. Probably remember some of these. Specifically, January 6th, most recently, we talked about power outages. There was a power outage at Opal. A lot of processing plants were down. It's kind of a perfect storm, it seemed like. Also, most recently on the 20th, we talked about basically not having supplies available to buy even intraday, or having a hard time finding supplies on that day. And unfortunately, we expect this problem to continue when cold weather occurs and when it's extended. Usually for one day, at least typically in those situations, for one day, things kind of are okay, they limp along, but if it lasts for more than that, then we start seeing problems going forward and trying to make plans going forward is kind of
Tina,
issue.
on-
Yeah.
on that slide, were there customer consequences associated with any of those 5?
Not residential,
Shortfalls.
thankfully. So nothing like we saw in the previous slides. We had interruptions to transportation customers during some of those days, not all of them. And we paid some high premiums on some of them to get gas, kind of in a short notice.
Okay, thank you.
And I think it's safe to say there's a lot more of these days. What we did to pull those days is we looked at the coldest day of each heating season, and on those days, looked to see if there were supply shortfalls, and there was pretty significant supply shortfalls on each of those days. I think if you dug deeper into any other cold days, you'd see even more days listed up there that we had supply shortfalls. It's something that we deal with all the time when it starts getting cold. I think a good example of that's the 20th here, as we just talked about, where it wasn't that cold. It was the coldest day this heating season, but it wasn't that cold, and we still were dealing with it. It's something that we kind of fight every time the weather starts getting cold.
Well, this is just looking back 5 years. What if you go back further in time? Have you had similar number of instances, or is it getting, you have more and more occurrences of these shortfalls?
My feeling is there's been more and more since 13. Occasionally we had some, I think the point 1990 when it was -4, we obviously had some issues, and unfortunately I'm old enough to remember that weekend, but I think part of it is also what Carol was saying, our load is growing. We don't have as much buffer maybe for our storage uses and things like that, and transportation, maybe there were ways that we could do without supply, but I don't think we had as much supply that didn't show up. There's people that believe because of the fact that we don't process as much in general, the industry doesn't process because there's not as much value in, the things they're getting out of the gas, that might be why wells are freezing off more. Also, it's just so unpredictable when that really cold weather is gonna happen each year, so whether the people that are managing the wells maybe don't do as much maintenance or injection of something that's gonna help not freeze off. It's kind of, they're playing the odds, right, of cost versus benefit, so. Someone else have a question?
Tina, well, yeah, I got one other. So would you say all of those 5 were principally driven by local conditions, or any of them driven principally by East Coast conditions, or, severe weather events in other parts of the country that were drawing the national gas supply in a different direction?
These were all local cold weather
Well,
events.
the 221, right? Didn't you say that was probably affected by eastern weather?
No, that was early in the year. That was
early in the year.
That was mainly our weather, and just the fact that it was the end of the long weekend made it.
Oh, okay. It was a different date. It wasn't a
the
supply
issues
shortfall.
there were operational, right? In terms of the gas supply that didn't show up was completely operational. It was a compressor issue at Vermilion and some plant issues at Blacks Fork. So.
And the supply, these are all coming from the market, not necessarily Wexpro either, or is it both?
Combination of both. Yep. Wexpro gas is still, produced the same way others is. We do, because we have control over it, we do a lot of stuff to manage the actual well heads, where they do some stuff that they can do, injecting stuff into the wells to make it not freeze off, but that's still flowing through plants that are not owned by Wexpro.
Is it uneven whether market gas affects these ongoing supply shortfalls, or is it Wexpro thing, but it's still the mix of both going forward?
Yeah, I think it's a mix of both.
Wexpro gas goes through processing plants that also have had issues in the past. Melanie?
Can you talk a little bit more about what exactly the weather events were, especially in light of the prior slide, which showed that the last event was in 1990?
Mm-hmm. So these were not anywhere near a peak day. That's definitely the first point. As far, you're asking how cold was it?
Well, you said that in response to Dave's question about what was driving this, the response was local weather events. I'd just like to better understand what you mean by that.
I think the question was this because of prices? Was this driven by weather?
Mm-hmm.
And there were a bunch of others we could list, probably 10 others where prices were really high, but that wasn't my concern. I mean, I don't want high prices to be passed on to the customers, but 10 days of high prices isn't gonna change the cost of gas that much. What I'm concerned about is people not having gas at any price, you know, and that's where these I felt were the closest situations where without supply, it doesn't matter if it's $100. You know, it's the gas isn't there because it's not being produced and we can't get it to our system. There have been other issues, I think it's been alluded to, where the bomb, cyclone, or things like that where it was really expensive, and we saw that, but it wasn't necessarily on a cold day, and it wasn't necessarily a big enough issue. I feel like, I mean, it is going to impact rates to a very small degree because we're all connected and the gas can go everywhere now, but the bigger concern is having customers without gas.
Tina, to answer her question, I think the first 4 of these events correlate really well with very cold temperatures in Wyoming.
Yes. Okay.
And that's where we were having the freeze-offs and plants issues.
Creates the, yeah.
And there is a correlation with price. I mean, obviously, it's a supply and demand. When you start losing supply because things are freezing off, you start having issues at plants, stuff like that, then everybody's fighting over the gas that is available there. So everybody's fighting for the same molecules, so people are willing to pay higher prices. And it's also driven in part by penalties. So if customer X charges a $100 penalty, like you've seen some $100 gas on the East Coast, a lot of that is driven by penalties because customer X will have a $100 penalty in place if you don't provide the gas. Well, you know what? My gas didn't show up. I'm willing to go out and buy $100 gas so I don't pay the $100 penalty over here. So they just keep driving things up. The limited supply and all that stuff, all the penalties, all the demand is making everybody fight over the gas, and it becomes in short supply, and supply and demand. Your supply goes down, your price goes up.
Yes.
So even with the 3-day ahead market, presumably the 3-day ahead market was being utilized during these timeframes. You're still encountering a supply issue?
Right, because you buy the gas and you nominate it even a day ahead and even intraday. You can make an arrangement with a supplier, but it doesn't mean the gas shows up. So someone will sell you gas thinking they have it, and then it turns out it doesn't ever make it through the chain.
Their plant freezes overnight and the gas never shows up.
It gets allocated. And so that's really what happened in Arizona, and I think New Mexico. They had enough supply. If you look at their supply portfolio, they say we had a forecast and it was going to be cold, and we had all the gas supply purchased under contract, firm contracts, but it didn't show up. And I guess that's what concerns me about our situation is luckily we haven't had a peak day. We haven't had an interruption of residential customers because of supply shortfalls, but that it could happen is, I guess, what I'm concerned about. Because if on a peak day, we're counting on you've probably seen in the IRP, all of our supplies that make up the peak day coverage, but if some of those don't show up and we can't get the gas anywhere else like Arizona couldn't, then our only choice is to disrupt customers' service.
And the difference between these days and a peak day is, like I said before, those aquifers, we kind of keep them in our back pocket. On these days, we had the aquifers in our back pocket, right? Meaning they weren't built into so we'll look at that cold day and say, okay, we've got, 150, let's say, deliverability out of the aquifers. We'll say, okay, we're going to buy as much gas as we need for the day. We're going to not plan to use that 150 of deliverability from the aquifers in case something goes wrong, right? Then we can pull the gas out of the aquifers, and that's what saved us on most of these days. The problem is, if you look now, if you take that and say, okay, well, why can't you do the same thing on a peak day? Well, our supply portfolio for that peak day already has that aquifer gas included. The way we can meet a peak day currently is to use that withdrawal from the aquifers already. So now we've once we get up to that point, our last 150 to meet the peak day is really coming from the aquifers. So there goes our back pocket. There goes our ace in the hole, whatever you want to call it. It's gone now because we're already using it on that day. That's what we need to meet a peak day.
So the question, at what point do you determine that the cost at market in such a scenario would be too extreme to pass up however much it would cost to get gas out of the aquifers. I mean, what's the price differential on the gas that you're buying as opposed to that back pocket reserve?
Right.
Is there-
I mean, that's something we'll do. If gas is very expensive, we will offset that. We'll look at the risk, and on that day we kind of know, because now you're looking at intraday gas. You kind of know how much isn't showing up, and like on the 20th, we had already utilized our aquifers, and we did have to buy some intraday gas. But if intraday gas prices are maybe only a little bit more, maybe we'll buy intraday. So we do that cost analysis right there and look to see is it worth using our aquifers first, and usually we'll go to the aquifer first because it's on that day. We know what the problem is already, But in planning for that, once we're already planning those aquifers into the day, that's our kind of our last resource.
And again, if there's multiple cold days, the aquifers don't perform the same. You know that. Okay.
One more question. How likely is it, or has it ever occurred where one of the larger customers has offered to donate gas? Is that an option for you to pull that gas into your system?
It does not happen that I'm aware of. I guess.
That's a benevolent customer.
You mean so.
Well, just hypothetically speaking, if such a customer was so inclined,
Yes.
Would it be possible to pull that into your system?
It would be on our system most likely, unless they diverted it. It would already be on our system. So if a customer chose not to burn, that would definitely help. I mean, we wouldn't know about it or see it till after the fact. But the problem we had on these days, as you might recall, some of them, a lot of the transportation customers in total were burning more than they brought the gas on. So really, it was the opposite of what you're saying. So.
And they're also coming from some of the same supply sources, right? So they may have the same cuts that you're experiencing.
Yeah.
That was what I was going to say. Is you've got to make sure that their supply is getting to the system as well, because they are going through the same pipes. They're coming from the same places. They're coming from the same plants. So if their gas is getting there, then yes, that is an option if they're willing to shut down and sell it to us, and we are looking into that as well.
And on one of these days, you probably recall too, we were talking about how we were looking at it at 6 or 5 in the morning and seeing electronically that the plants were not producing what we would expect to see them, or they were at 0. And a lot of their gas, the transportation customers' gas, were also coming from those plants. So a lot of it is everyone scrambling to buy intraday from the few sources that are left to make up the shortfall. So. Any other? Okay. A lot of this maybe we've talked about or is obvious, but I was trying to convey, I guess, our feeling when we're looking into an event like this. We don't know the extent or the length of the disruption. We have to kind of assume it's going to continue. Sometimes it gets worse. Some of the suppliers might be telling us we're getting our plant back on, the gas is going to be there. Sometimes it is, usually it's not, in our past five experiences anyway. And so you kind of have to go worst case scenario at this point in time when you're looking at the event, forward looking. You have to make knowledge without knowing how much your demand's going to change or how much the supply disruptions are going to change. If they're going to, in most cases it seems like we're waiting, we think there's going to be an improvement, and then the power goes out at a plant and it takes you down another level and you have to adjust. So we try to be proactive. Replacement gas is typically expensive, not always available. We experienced this on February 20th, and it wasn't even a cold day. But if it was going to be a cold day or expected cold day, it's more of a crisis at that point in time. So the bottom line is reliable, firm service is important to our customers, it's important to us, and I assume it's important to the regulators. We need a tool to improve the reliability for the customers to avoid future service outages, especially since we know when we try to meet our peak day, we're counting on all of the supplies being there, and realistically we know that all the supplies don't show up, so we feel it's responsible to look at options. And so far, this is just a few of the options we're looking at, where we have evaluated. Rickman is the R. You notice we've looking at storage from Rickman. Magnum is down by Delta. We're evaluating basically all of the options that we think could help solve this problem. Carol, did you have a question?
When you say looking at storage of Rickman, there's already money in the 191 for Rickman demand. Are you looking for more? Is that what are you using that aquifer
A little
right
bit.
now?
A little bit, yeah. Yeah, we still have a contract with them for a couple more years. And so that's what you see in the 191 account. But this would be like, is there places where there's additional capacity? Right now, Clay Basin is, I didn't put it on here, but they're talking about an expansion, or there's an open season out there. That's something we have to look at. But other than that, Clay Basin is fully subscribed, so I didn't say it, incrementally. Magnum, and then the L is for LNG in the Salt Lake Valley. So we're looking at evaluating options and locations. Currently, that's what we've been working on to try to solve this problem that we see.
So are you using, with the Rickman, do you have as much in there as you possibly can, or do they still have operational problems that?
Let's see, we have not as much as we can. We've been using it kind of in reserve in case we see a cold event coming. We put gas in there so we can supplement our supply in case of a supply shortfall. We don't have it to our full contract capacity because we felt like, at least so far, it's been too risky and there hasn't really been a need this year to do that. We'll probably inject more, I'm guessing, this summer. I mean, that'll be part of the IRP discussion for next heating season. But we do have some gas in there, a small amount. And we really have a small contract to begin with. I mean, it's a very small volume.
Yeah, we've really only been using operational. We've almost put in what we take out, but that's because they were going through some bankruptcy proceedings and stuff like that until recently they were purchased by someone else. But that was kind of right in the middle of the heating season, so it didn't make sense for us really to be putting a lot of gas into Rickman. Starting here in the spring, Scott will run his modeling as part of the IRP, and I assume it's going to have us put that gas into Rickman, basically fill it up over the summer, and then we'll have it available for next year. But there's been other operational concerns and everything as to why we didn't necessarily use that Rickman contract that it started. But now I think we're to a point where our confidence level is high enough to start actually using that contract.
So that was what, when you said it's too risky, it was just what you were
Yeah.
talking about.
Other questions? Doug, no questions? Okay. I think that's all I have. I don't know what time it is, but hopefully it's another half hour. Okay.
So our next technical conference will be the 24th. That's Brady Rasmussen, and we'll go over our RFP for gas account. So thank you.
And that's gonna
Yeah,
be a
that is a confidential
yes.
meeting, yeah.